Let's get right to NBC News correspondent Leanne Caldwell, who is on Capitol Hill. Leanne, your reaction, your thoughts on the vote on the floor today. I know you've been following these lawmakers throughout. Did this vote go as you expected? Anyone really surprise you here?
So what ended up happening was 10 House Republicans ended up voting with all Democrats in support of impeaching this president for the second time. Remember, last time the president was impeached just about a year ago, no Republicans joined on. So one of the most surprising things to me, Allison, was one lawmaker, Representative Rice of South Carolina. He comes from a very conservative district, including the third most conservative county in the state. He's not someone who usually bucks the party, not someone who bucks the president at all. He's kind of been a under the radar type of lawmaker. But the fact that he came out in support of impeachment today was really astonishing, actually. Of course, there was Representative Liz Cheney, who the most influential and high-ranking Republican.
What's happening, friends? Welcome to Jack Mockler Right Now. Washington is in full crisis mode as a historic congressional showdown unfolds, with headlines suggesting an unprecedented accountability moment for the presidency. The nation is watching to see if this is the moment the constitutional hammer finally drops. Before getting swept up in the drama, it's crucial to understand the constitutional machinery, historical precedents, and cold political arithmetic behind presidential removal. The current showdown is intense, but what's constitutionally possible is often more limited than the headlines suggest. The constitutional architecture they created was deliberately crafted to make removal difficult, to require overwhelming consensus, and to prevent the kind of instantaneous political vengeance.
Who did come out for impeachment as well. And then there was one statement that I also want to note of Representative McCall. He is a leading member, the chair of the Armed Services Committee and, Foreign Relations Committee, or he was anyway. And he said that he voted against impeachment, but he said perhaps he might come out on the wrong side of history. He acknowledged that there were lots of problems, and he's not sure if his vote against impeachment was the right one. But politically, Allison, all 10 of these Republicans who voted to impeach, one thing that's interesting is our colleague Carrie Dan. She notes that all 10 of them outperformed the president in their conservative districts in the 2020 election, Allison.
Oh, that is really interesting for sure, Leanne. So what stood out in particular to you about today? I know this is a day unlike any other, but was there one moment where you just said, wow, this really struck me?
I was really watching to see how House Republicans who were against impeachment were going to frame their argument. And they were all over the place. There was not one unified message. Some Republicans were saying that
the most dramatic headlines might suggest is possible. And yet here we are, watching history unfold in real time, with the accumulated weight of years of political battles finally converging on a moment that could reshape the American presidency forever, or alternatively, could serve as yet another reminder of just how difficult it is to remove a sitting president through constitutional means. The tension between the dramatic urgency of the breaking news and the deliberate slowness of the constitutional process is the central drama of this moment, and understanding that tension is the key to making sense of what is actually happening versus what the most dramatic headlines would have us believe.
they needed to unify the country and not divide the country. That's why they didn't support impeachment. Some were blaming Democrats and blaming the left, basically saying that impeachment was another witch hunt, which the president said the other day. And then there were people like the leader, Kevin McCarthy, who for the very first time, he said that the president, publicly anyway, said the president bears some responsibility. And he also, for the first time, said that Joe Biden won the election. Let's take a listen.
Let's be clear. Joe Biden will be sworn in as President of the United States in 1 week because he won the election. And the presidency and this Congress will face immediate challenges that must be addressed. I stand ready to assist in that effort with good faith, goodwill, and an open hand.
The reason it is significant that McCarthy said that Joe Biden did win the election, because let's remember the roots of what happened here. It's because the president and so many Republicans would refuse.
Let's dig into the constitutional mechanics that are at play here, because understanding how the impeachment process actually works is essential to understanding why the before morning framing is so fundamentally flawed. The founders, in their infinite wisdom and with the fresh memory of monarchical abuse still burning in their minds, created a two-stage process for presidential removal that was deliberately designed to be slow, deliberate, and difficult to achieve. The House of Representatives, under Article 1 of the Constitution, holds the sole power of impeachment, which functions essentially as a formal charging mechanism, much like a criminal indictment in the judicial system.
To admit that, riling up their supporters, leading to what we saw just 1 week ago in the Capitol, Allison.
Leanne, let's talk a little bit more about the Republicans. You said 10 House Republicans voted to impeach President Trump this time around. Yesterday, we heard from the number 3 House Republican, Liz Cheney, saying that she did intend to vote in favor of impeachment. How big of an impact did her vote, did her announcing that vote in advance, do you think, have on the rest of the GOP?
I think it gave some Republican members some comfort to, in fact, come out and vote for impeachment. It wasn't a flood. The dam did not break. There were not dozens, but there were 10. And some of these Republicans felt like they had some cover, especially a freshman, Representative Mayor of Michigan, who this is one of the very first votes he's had to take in Congress. But I will say, Cheney's position has really divided the party. There are members, including freshman members, who are saying that she should lose her leadership position, saying that she has no right to be a Republican leader. Now we're seeing some members who voted also against impeachment coming out.
This first stage requires only a simple majority vote in the House, which is why we've seen impeachment articles pass twice against Trump during his first term. The House can move relatively quickly when there's sufficient political will, and in both instances, the Democratic majority was able to muster enough votes to send articles of impeachment to the Senate. But this is where the constitutional design gets really interesting, and where the drama of the before morning framing completely breaks down against the hard reality of constitutional requirements. Once the House votes to impeach, the articles are transmitted to the Senate, which holds the sole power to try impeachments under the Constitution. And this is where the founders' deliberate design for deliberation and consensus really kicks in.
And saying that Cheney has more, like Representative Dan Crenshaw just put out a tweet saying that even though he did not support impeachment, Representative Cheney has a lot more backbone than a lot of his colleagues. So this is just the very beginning, Allison, of a really big fissure and fracture in the Republican Party. And it's going to be quite a story to see how it repairs itself if it can.
Yeah, a lot of people wondering how they're going to do that. Leanne, Speaker Pelosi named the 9 House managers who will prosecute President Trump in the Senate trial. Congressman Jamie Raskin will lead that group. Could you tell us a little bit more about the group, about these managers?
Every single one of them has a legal background. A lot of them are prosecutors. 3 of those are the ones who wrote the article of impeachment, including Jamie Raskin, Representative Ted Lieu, and David Cicilline as well. And they, when Pelosi chooses the people that she wants to represent them, or be impeachment managers. And remember, that's for the Senate trial. When this does go to the Senate, she thinks about the circumstance and their skill set. And she also takes into consideration diversity as well. But you can tell in this group that the ability to prosecute a case was critical in her decision-making process. Allison.
The Senate trial is not a rubber stamp or a quick procedural formality. It's a full trial proceeding with specific constitutional requirements for receiving evidence, hearing arguments, and conducting a formal deliberation that the founders believed was essential before any president could be removed from office. They wanted time, they wanted careful consideration, and they wanted to prevent exactly the kind of instantaneous removal that the most dramatic headlines might suggest is possible. But the most consequential part of this entire constitutional design is the specific threshold required for conviction. The founders didn't just require a simple majority in the Senate, they required a 2/3 supermajority for conviction, a threshold that has proven to be extraordinarily difficult to reach throughout American history. No president has ever been convicted and removed from office through the impeachment process. And that's not because there haven't been presidents who engaged in conduct that some considered impeachable. It's because the two-thirds threshold is so deliberately high that it requires a level of bipartisan consensus that has rarely existed in American politics, and particularly not in the hyper-partisan environment of the Trump era. The specific supermajority requirement is the most deliberately constructed barrier in the entire impeachment process, and it is the single most important design feature for understanding why the before-morning removal framing is not just politically unlikely, but constitutionally impossible under any realistic scenario. The founders didn't want presidents to be removable by a simple partisan majority. They wanted removal to require broad cross-partisan support that would ensure legitimacy and prevent the kind of political vendetta that could destabilize the republic. The historical record with Trump's impeachments is absolutely essential for understanding where we actually stand on the accountability scoreboard. When the first impeachment came before the Senate, the specific vote totals told a story that the most dramatic headlines of the time couldn't quite capture. The articles related to Ukraine produced Senate votes of 52 to 48 and 53 to 47, which might sound close to a majority, but that's not the relevant threshold. The relevant threshold was and remains 67 votes for conviction, and these vote totals were nowhere close. In fact, more senators voted to acquit than to convict on both articles, with 52 and 53 senators respectively voting not guilty. That's not just a failure to reach the supermajority threshold, it's a failure to even reach a simple majority for conviction. The Senate, in its constitutional role as the trial body, had spoken, and the outcome was a decisive acquittal that permanently determined Trump's constitutional status at the conclusion of that first trial. The second impeachment, following the events of January 6th, produced what initially looks like a much closer vote, with 57 senators voting to convict on the incitement of insurrection charge. This was indeed the most bipartisan presidential conviction vote in American history, with 7 Republican senators crossing party lines to join 50 Democrats in voting for conviction. Those 7 Republicans were Romney, Collins, Murkowski, Sasse, Toomey, Burr, and Cassidy, each of whom made what must have been an extraordinarily difficult political calculation given their party's loyalty to the president. The 57 to 43 vote total represents the high watermark of presidential impeachment convictions in American history, and it's genuinely unprecedented that so many senators from the president's own party would vote to convict. But here's the crucial detail that the before-morning framing obscures. 57 votes is still 10 votes short of the 67 required for conviction. That gap of 10 votes is the central accountability fact that must be understood to make sense of the entire impeachment story. The 7 Republican senators who crossed in the second trial established a baseline for Republican Senate conviction availability in the most acute triggering context imaginable, the context of a president inciting an insurrection against the very government he was supposed to be leading. If that context produced only 7 Republican senators willing to vote for conviction, the question of where 10 more would come from in any future scenario becomes extraordinarily difficult to answer. The specific constitutional arithmetic, the 57 achieved versus the 67 required, with that 10-vote gap sitting in the middle like an unbridgeable chasm, is the accountability mathematics that any honest assessment of the impeachment record must confront. The most alarming thing about the Trump impeachment record is simultaneously the most paradoxical, that the most bipartisan presidential conviction vote in American history was still 10 votes short of the threshold required to actually produce a conviction and removal. That paradox encapsulates everything that is both dramatic and frustrating about the constitutional design for presidential removal. And it's the central reason why the before-morning framing is reaching towards something historically alarming, while simultaneously requiring the most explicit constitutional qualification of its most dramatically immediate reading. The current accountability landscape in the second term has produced something genuinely new and significant in the form of organized removal advocacy that goes beyond anything we saw during the first term. The Green and Larson formal articles, the 120-plus member removal constituency, the 140-member advanced vote, and the sustained formal advocacy whose organizational development reflects the accumulated impact of the most alarming second-term executive conduct, are all real developments that ground the just-in and breaking quality of the current headlines in something that is authentically documented and genuinely consequential. What we're seeing is the most formally organized and constitutionally sophisticated removal effort since the two prior formal impeachments, and that organizational sophistication reflects how the accumulated accountability record has transformed the political calculus around removal advocacy. This is not just random political posturing. This is a deliberate, strategic effort to build the kind of formal accountability record that could potentially lead to impeachment articles being transmitted to the Senate. The furious Congress quality is real and documented in the floor speeches, the formal resolutions, and the specific advocacy developments that have been building over time. But even with this unprecedented organizational development, the constitutional arithmetic remains the same unyielding barrier that it has always been. The Senate, with its current partisan configuration, requires approximately 17 Republican senators to cross from the protection column to the conviction column, assuming all Democratic senators vote for conviction. The gap between the 7 Republicans who crossed in the second trial and the 17 that would be required for conviction in a future trial is 10 votes. And those 10 additional votes would need to come from somewhere in a political environment that has only become more polarized and more loyal to the president. The specific current political arithmetic is the most consequentially relevant accountability analysis for understanding the gap between the organizational developments that create the breaking news energy and the constitutional threshold that would be required to actually produce a removal outcome. The just-in framing is authentically grounded in real advocacy developments, but the finalized removal framing is reaching for a constitutional outcome that remains as far away as it has ever been. The gap between the 120-plus member removal constituency in the House and the 67 Senate votes required for conviction is the accountability mathematics that any honest assessment must confront, and that gap is what makes the before-morning framing simultaneously dramatic and constitutionally impossible. The constitutional design that prevents overnight removal is not an accident or a loophole. It's a deliberate architectural choice that reflects the founders' most urgent concerns about the stability of the republic. They had just fought a revolution against a monarch who could be removed only through violent insurrection, and they were determined to create a system where executive removal would be possible, but only through careful, deliberate, broadly supported constitutional processes. The two-thirds Senate conviction threshold is the specific provision most directly reflecting that founding judgment and its presence in the constitutional design is not a bug to be worked around, but a feature to be respected. The founders understood that the most consequential available legislative action, removing a president from office, required the most broad and the most formally deliberated cross-partisan accountability consensus that the constitutional design could produce. They understood that simple majority rule was insufficient for such a consequential action, that partisan majorities might be tempted to remove a president for purely political reasons, and that the legitimacy of any removal would depend on the broad support that only a supermajority could provide. The specific Senate trial requirements, the multi-step deliberative process, and the formal procedures for receiving evidence and hearing arguments all reflect the same founding judgment that presidential removal requires time, careful consideration, and broad consensus. Even in the fastest available constitutional scenario, the most expedited version of the accountability process, the constitutional design requires specific House action, specific Senate trial procedures, and the specific final two-thirds conviction vote that has never been achieved for any president in American history. The specific process is designed to prevent the specific kind of single-night legislative impulse that the before-morning framing most dramatically imagines as constitutionally available. The founders were not naive about the possibility of political passion sweeping through the legislature. They had seen it happen in state legislatures and in the British Parliament, and they were determined to create constitutional barriers that would force deliberation and consensus before any president could be removed from office. The specific deliberateness of the constitutional design is the civic education most urgently required for audiences seeking both the dramatic accountability energy of the breaking news and the constitutional understanding that enables them to evaluate that news accurately. Understanding that before morning overnight removal is constitutionally impossible rather than merely politically unlikely is the single most important takeaway for anyone following this story, and it transforms the experience from one of dramatic suspense to one of sophisticated constitutional awareness. The specific paradox of Trump's twice impeached, twice acquitted status is the central accountability fact that every honest assessment of the situation must confront. Twice impeached is the most unprecedented accountability designation in the American presidential record, a formal legislative accountability action taken more times against Trump than against any prior American president. This is genuinely historic and genuinely alarming, a reflection of how much conflict and controversy have marked his presidency. But twice acquitted is the equally important formal constitutional outcome that most directly determines Trump's continuing eligibility to serve and the continuing legitimacy of his presidency under constitutional law. The specific formal result, whose twice-achieved quality establishes that the Senate constitutional majority required for the most consequential formal accountability outcome, has twice failed to reach the specific threshold required for conviction and removal. The political aftermath of the two acquittals has been profound, with analysts arguing that the acquittals have emboldened Trump and reshaped the balance of power between Congress and the presidency in ways that have long-term institutional consequences. The specific emboldening effect is not a peripheral commentary observation, but the specific, most consequentially alarming accountability assessment, most directly addressing what the constitutional design's failure to reach the two-thirds conviction threshold most consequentially produces. When the most formal available legislative accountability mechanism twice fails to produce the formal conviction outcome designed to establish institutional constraint, the emboldening effect is the most alarming available constitutional consequence produced by that twice-repeated failure. The specific argument that repeated acquittals have emboldened the president is the most alarming available accountability analysis of what the constitutional outcome of twice acquitted produces in the specific political and institutional environment most urgently affected by those outcomes. The balance of power between Congress and the presidency has been reshaped by the failure of the impeachment process to produce a conviction, and that reshaping has made the current accountability efforts both more urgent and more difficult to achieve. The specific emboldening effect and the institutional consequences that flow from it are what makes the before morning framing's dramatic accountability energy so urgent and so necessary to engage with honestly. The just in framing is reaching towards something genuinely consequential, the long-term institutional consequences of a presidency that has faced unprecedented formal accountability actions and survived them, but the finalized removal framing remains a constitutional fiction that the founders deliberately designed the system to prevent. The full picture of the constitutional impeachment architecture is one that requires us to hold multiple truths in our minds simultaneously. The House can impeach with a simple majority, and has done so twice, establishing a formal accountability record that is genuinely unprecedented in American history. The Senate requires two-thirds to convict, and has never reached that threshold for Trump, with the first trial producing 52 to 48 and 53 to 47 acquittals, and the second producing the 57 to 43 acquittal that was simultaneously the most bipartisan presidential conviction vote in American history, and 10 votes short of conviction. The current second-term formal advocacy has produced the most organized removal effort in American history, with formal articles, a large removal constituency, and sustained organizational development that reflects the accumulated impact of second-term executive conduct. But any new impeachment effort would still face the same constitutional arithmetic: a House majority to impeach and 67 Senate votes to convict that do not currently exist. The just an impeachment finalized as furious Congress demands Trump gone before morning, Framing captures the specific quality of the accumulated formal accountability record, the two formal House impeachments, the most bipartisan presidential conviction vote in American history at 57 to 43, the specific 120-plus member second-term removal constituency, the specific 140-member advanced vote, and the accumulated formal advocacy dynamics most urgently generating the before-morning explosive breaking news energy. The headline's most dramatic reading is reaching toward the constitutional impossibility, but the furious Congress quality is a specific, accurately documented accountability constituent most directly grounding the before-morning urgency in something real and formally documented. The constitutional arithmetic, the 57 achieved, the 67 required, the 10 vote gap, is the specific, most consequentially honest version of the accountability story that any audience most urgently seeking the most alarming and the most completely grounded version of the Trump impeachment accountability story is most directly deserving of receiving. The specific scoreboard is the most honest version of the accountability story. 2 impeachments, 0 convictions, 52 to 48 and 53 to 47 acquittals in the first trial, 57 to 43 acquittal in the second, 7 Republican senators who crossed in the most bipartisan presidential conviction vote in American history, and 10 more needed to reach 67. The before-morning overnight removal is the most dramatic fictional compression of the most urgently building formal advocacy dynamics into the most immediately decisive accountability outcome the constitutional design most directly prevents. And the furious Congress quality is as real as the 120-plus member removal constituency and the 140-member advanced vote most urgently documented in the specific, most formally developed and most organizationally sophisticated removal advocacy of the current second-term period. The scoreboard is real, the finalized removal is fictional, and the just and breaking energy is the authentic expression of formal accountability dynamics whose accumulated organizational development most urgently generates the most explosive congressional accountability atmosphere of the current term. The constitutional design is as deliberately constructed as any feature of the American governance architecture, with the two-thirds threshold, the Senate trial requirements, and the multi-step deliberative process, each encoding the founding judgment that removing a president from office requires the most broad and the most formally deliberated cross-partisan accountability consensus available in the constitutional design. The founding deliberateness of that constitutional design is the civic education most urgently required for audiences seeking both the dramatic accountability energy and the constitutional understanding that enables them to follow the accountability scoreboard honestly. The specific accountability story is as alarming in its twice impeached, twice acquitted paradoxical form as any single finalized before morning scenario the most immediately explosive available framing can describe, and the constitutional arithmetic of 57 achieved, 67 required, 10 votes remaining, is the accountability mathematics that any honest engagement with this historic moment must confront.